Good afternoon, everyone. Similarly, I'd like to thank the AIIA and DFAT for hosting us, and thanks also to Caitlin, Susan and Melissa for organising the event. It's good to see such vitality around Australian diplomacy. I also have to warn the timekeeper not to ring the bell too loudly. As I'm talking about sport, I might end up running around the room. Like it or loathe it, sport and politics do mix, these days with greater frequency. When it provides a function beyond the game, sport is often co-opted by governments. As the Australian scholar Graham Allison notes, all kinds of states have endorsed international sporting competition as a testing ground for the nation or for a political system. German Nazis, Italian fascists, Soviet and Cuban communists, Chinese Maoists, Western democracies, Latin American juntas have all played the game and believe in it. Despite its longevity and prominence, however, sports are a relatively underexplored feature of international relations and diplomacy, and until recently, very little was known of the means of such exchanges, sports diplomacy, the subject I'll address today. All that existed until recently were a sort of plethora of papers in ping-pong diplomacy. If I have to read another paper in ping-pong diplomacy, I might have to walk out the room. The relationship of sport, diplomacy in apartheid South Africa, or the baseball diplomacy intermittently practiced between Cuba and the United States, but no one was really thinking about it too deeply. Academics began to write about sport and diplomacy about 5 or 6 years ago now, and there's plenty of theory on sports diplomacy, but there's far less scholarship assessing the practice of sports diplomacy. How a ministry builds a sports diplomacy strategy, that is how the theory is reconciled in practice. So that's a gap I hope my paper fills, or at least begins to fill. Using DFAT as a case study, I'm arguing that with appropriate ministerial support and innovative diplomats, both the theory and practice of sports diplomacy have a bright, promising future. And compared to the growing pains of globalisation, sports diplomacy is a positive phenomenon that should be encouraged. To understand the term, first of all, is to contextualise the modern diplomatic environment. When we think about traditional diplomacy, it no longer has a monopoly in foreign affairs. It's lost that gatekeeper tag that it had for so many centuries. Of course, traditional diplomacy endures, but Brian Hawking's multi-stakeholder paradigm, where diplomacy is an activity concerned with the creation of networks, embracing a range of state and non-state actors, more aptly describes the character of modern diplomacy. And often these actors coalesce in fluid, ad hoc and polylateral diplomatic networks. So in this dynamic environment, hard as it may be to believe, music, art, sport, and even food have become the subject of serious academic inquiry. All are universal languages where no words are spoken, and they're increasingly relevant soft power tools for modern diplomacy. And I want to stress that idea of universality. With sport, I'm sure you've all been in some foreign country, and your relationship with colleagues, locals or other tourists indeed, has been boosted by sport. It provides a common bond. And I thought an appropriate example was to give you an example from Minister Bishop. In 2002, Julie Bishop served as an election observer in Zimbabwe during the height of the farm grab by Mugabe's war veterans. In a remote area, she visited a farm and met with what she called a group of thugs. She notes, "I was introduced to the leader of the gang, toothless, bike chains around his neck, wearing animal skins, a machete and a machine gun. Miss Bishop quickly clarified to the leader of the group she was Australian and not British. She continues, the leader of the group looked me up and down and said, 'You don't know Shane Warne, do you?' The moment was saved." Embedding sport in a state's diplomacy is beneficial for many reasons. Sports diplomacy can transcend acrimony and diplomatic relationships. It can bring estranged leaders together. The cricket diplomacy between India and Pakistan is a great example. It can generate massive public diplomacy opportunities. 1.1 billion people tuned in to watch the opening ceremony of the 2008 Olympics, and more recently 620 million people watched the British Open at St Andrews. It can amplify a state's diplomatic message, culture or values. It's also low risk, low cost and high profile. And finally, sports diplomacy dovetails with other new forms, chiefly public and digital diplomacy. So in a traditional sense, and being an academic, I've got to define my term. Sports diplomacy can be defined as the use of sports people in sporting events to engage, inform and create a favourable image among foreign publics and organisations to shape their perceptions in a way that is more conducive to the sending government's foreign policy goals. In terms of developed strategies, however, there are only a few nations that have fully embraced sports diplomacy. Leading the race is the American Department of State, which I go into in the paper. Other nations such as Canada, Kazakhstan, Israel and the United Kingdom have dabbled with certain programs, but their efforts have been sporadic and somewhat short-lived. China is starting to move towards sports diplomacy. The 2008 Games were a massive success for changing the perception of China. They've just hosted the Athletic World Championships, won the rights to host the 2022 Winter Olympics, and this is my hot tip, and I'm actually going to make a beeline for a TAB shortly. China will win the rights to host the 2026 World Football Cup for a number of reasons. President Xi recently disclosed his love of football. No one had ever heard of this before. He picked up a football and he says, you know what, I've always loved football. And he declared himself to be a lifelong Aston Villa supporter. Oddly enough, bad choice. However, and I repeat, few nations have leveraged sport in a regular diplomatic sense or have elevated it to the strategic policy level. So therefore, DFAT's recent desire to exploit sport as a diplomatic and foreign policy tool stands to set it apart from other nations. I got interested in Australian diplomacy and sport a few years back. I wrote a paper on it in 2013. The other thing that interested me in it was my Scottishness, mainly because I come from a nation that doesn't really do well in sport other than King Andy Murray. So compared to my native Scotland, when I looked at Australia's international sporting presence, pedigree and facilities, I was gobsmacked. Australia is one of only two nations to have competed in every Olympic Games, Greece being the other. At the last 5 games held in Atlanta, Sydney, Greece, Beijing, London, they finished respectively 7th, 4th, 4th, 6th and 10th. Not bad for a country of 20 million people, roughly. The Aussies have successfully hosted many mega events, they have world-class sporting facilities, and they continue to produce dozens of male and female world champion teams and individuals, the latest being, of course, Jason Day. However, it's not just at the elite levels where sport flourishes. A 2010 survey by the Australian Sports Commission found that an estimated 12.2 million people aged 15 or over, or 69.4% of the population, participated in physical activity. Funnily enough, Bill Bryson, the travel author, commented, and I quote, "Australia pretty much beats most people at most things. Never has there been a more sporting nation. It is a wonder in such a vigorous and active society that there is anyone left to form an audience." Sport is woven into the fabric of Australian society. It's embedded in the nation's soul and collective memory. And just ask anyone and they'll tell you about Alan Bond. This is what they're all about. It plays a major role in shaping the country's identity and culture, so much so that DFAT often referred to sport as Australia's national religion. So it was only a matter of time before it began to figure in the representation of the diplomatic activities. DFAT began to get serious in using sport as a diplomatic tool as a result of the Australian and Asian Century White Paper, which touted sport as, and I quote, "a way to deepen and broaden engagement with the region and build greater understanding, foster cultural appreciation and offer commercial opportunities. A more conscious use of sport would open doors and create links between people in the region, from businessmen to players, fans and coaches." Without sounding sycophantic, much of the credit for DFAT's attitude shift must go to a small group of individuals, a team of champions, if you like. They are Rob Tranter, Martin Roberts, Lisa Wright, Lou Anderson and Chris Martin, who all deserve a pat on the back. This team desired to give sports diplomacy greater coherence across Australian government agencies to join the dots, in Rob Tranter's words. From the outset, they sought to develop mutual areas of interest, to work together and coordinate with other agencies such as Austrade or the Office of Sport, to promote sports for mutual and strategic advantage. So what they sought to do simply was to synergise and codify the many aspects of Australia's international sporting presence into a new sports diplomacy strategy to once again act as a gatekeeper, if you like. I go into the development of the strategy in the paper, and I provide lots of examples, but time's against me here. But the results of DFAT's efforts over the past 3 years is a freshly minted sports diplomacy strategy, which was launched by the Foreign and Sports Ministers on the 25th of June this year. You can get a copy of the strategy off DFAT's website, or in fact I saw there's a neat pile of them sitting down there. This is the hallowed document itself. There's also a superb video clip where a number of Australian sports stars explain the strategy itself, and I have to say, hearing Jonathan Thurston and Maddie Robinson, the captain of the Diamonds netball team, talking about sports diplomacy, it still gives me goosebumps. It's a wonderful little clip. The strategy itself outlines a whole-of-government approach that will maximise people-to-people links, development, cultural trade, investment, education and tourism opportunities, and it's built around 4 goals: connecting people and institutions, sport for development, showcasing Australia, and supporting innovation and integrity. So with this strategy, at last Australia's notable footprint in international sport will be leveraged in a consistent, organised and coherent statewide fashion, with DFAT operating at the centre of the network. As the Foreign Minister said at the launch, the strategy signals a new era of partnership between the Australian Government and sporting organisations. Together we will leverage our outstanding sport skills, facilities and knowledge to promote Australia and strengthen our links with countries and communities in the region. To finish up, I just want to look at a few challenges. There's a few obvious ones facing the strategy. The vicissitudes of DFAT's budget experiences have been summarised by others, the Lowy Institute, Alex in particular, the ABC and others. So, the funding question always comes up, and especially in these austere times, financial support is by no means a given, especially for untested adventures. A second challenge the strategy faces is temporal. It runs from 2015 to 2018, obviously. What happens after that? How will the impact of sports diplomacy be measured? Validating the results of certain soft cultural or public initiatives is notoriously difficult to measure. And finally, this question's been nagging me for years now. How diplomatic are international sport and sports people? Cheating in world cycling. David Warner punching Joe Root in 2013, and then 2 years later been awarded the great prize of the vice-captaincy of the cricket team. Mass corruption in FIFA. Endemic doping in world athletics. Idiotic comments by so-called ambassadors of sport such as Cristiano Ronaldo. And Nick Kyrgios doing everything he can in his powers to offend everyone in world tennis. I could go on. Sadly, I feel that international sport suffers from a diplomatic deficit, to borrow from the Louis term. When winning is prized above all, which is not very diplomatic, and we can talk about it over a coffee a bit later on. So relating that to Australia, we have to ask, is Australian sport a good partner for Australian diplomacy? And I'll give you an example which might court trouble, rouse the passions, and again cause me to be ejected from the building. I'm talking about the 2015 World Cup cricket final between Australia and New Zealand, where veteran sports columnist Greg Baum lamented the conduct of the Australian players, particularly the relentless sledging of New Zealand batsman Grant Elliott. He wrote, "The Australian team do not seem to grasp nor care how poorly this behaviour sits with the other half of a cricket-following public they repeatedly and ever more divide, how it rankles with opponents and how insufferably arrogant it makes them look. What is objectionable is the snark, the cattiness, the goads and provocations. What is objectionable is to rub a dismissed batsman in his batsman's nose in it, in his dismissal rather than let the wicket speak for itself." Well, many Australians I've spoken to said, well, this is just the nature of the trans-Tasman sporting rivalry. The word chapel comes up a lot. Or they might say, well, we won, didn't we? That's the whole point. But such conduct is just not cricket, nor is it diplomacy. So these comments allude to a key challenge for DFAT's recent strategy. Success in sport does not guarantee success in diplomacy, a point unequivocally proven by former NBA superstar Dennis Rodman's relationship with Kim Jong-un, who he described as an awesome guy. Should Australian sports people be encouraged to be more than just winners, to be diplomats? Absolutely. In conclusion, sport alone is no panacea to the growing pains of globalisation, to terrorism, climate change, or a wobbling Chinese economy. It never has been and never will be. However, working in tandem with established forms of traditional diplomacy, it can foster greater communication, exchange and interaction. Sports diplomacy offers a unique prism through which to view evolutions in the theory and practice of modern diplomacy. Of course, the haute politique will still endure, but such traditions are being complemented by new, dynamic experiments with diplomacy, which breathe new life into a vital structure of the IR system. Thank you very much.